All right, this is the movements through cell membranes, and we're going to do three. We're going to do diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So what this means, why does this pertain to cells? Okay, there are certain times when a cell has to get water, nutrients, oxygen, and that can be accomplished two ways, either through what is called a passive movement or an active movement, which is active transport, which uses energy. Passive movements do not require cellular energy at all. Diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. And these are laws. And active, like I said, is energy requiring. It does require ATP produced from cell respiration, stuff we talked about last week. So we're going to do this one first. Diffusion, passive movement. Diffusion very simply states molecules that are in high concentration have a natural tendency to move to areas where there's less concentration of molecules. What this is based on, molecules that are highly concentrated in one area, they have more collisions, and their natural tendency is to move to an area where there's less collisions. So diffusion is movement of particles from high concentration to low concentration. I can give you a real life example. For human beings, blood going through the lungs has a dark blue color because it's low in oxygen. It's gone through the body. The lungs are set up and designed to have very permeable membranes for oxygen. The blood flowing through the lungs, it actually goes around these little areas called alveoli, air sacs. And if a person's breathing normally, oxygen levels in the lungs are very high. If you measured it, it's about 100 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure is. The partial pressure of oxygen going through the lungs in blood is about 40 millimeters of mercury. So across that diffusible membrane, oxygen is going to start diffusing into the bloodstream because oxygen's high in the lungs, it's low in the blood. And what ends up happening is the blood leaving the lungs has a oxygen level of about 96. It's not 100%, but 96 millimeters of mercury, the partial pressure. And that's a real life example of diffusion. Bacteria use diffusion. If you put them in an area on a petri dish that has lots of nutrients, they can grow faster, better, because those nutrients are diffusing into their cell, more so than they would maybe in the natural environment. So that's diffusion. Facilitated diffusion, and this is one more, so here's passive and active. Well, this is kind of showing that's a sugar cube that's dissolved in a solution. And just in chemistry, anything with a solution is called a solvent. Dissolved particles inside of a solvent are called solutes, S-O-L-U-T-E-S. That's showing like a sugar cube dispersing. That's actually by diffusion. That's not the water molecules moving. That's the particle. The fact that says salt. Here is facilitated diffusion. Here you have a high concentration of a substance that cannot cross the cell membrane. Remember the cell membrane, here's the polar, non-polar areas. It's selectively permeable. So here's an example where a molecule is moving into a transport channel or carrier molecule, carrier protein, and it's being pushed to the, not being pushed, it's being released on the other side. Basically, it's going through a channel. This does not require energy. High concentration here, lower concentration here. It's called facilitated diffusion because it's having to use a channel or carrier molecule to cross over into the inside of a cell. So that's why it's called facilitated diffusion. Okay, and we'll do osmosis next, but I thought I would give you a break here. Watch this really short video on diffusion.
What is diffusion? Ever wonder how substances move around the body, or how a metabolite gets in and out of the cell, or how perfume spray spread the aroma around in a matter of seconds, from the corner you spray it in to the rest of your room? Diffusion is to be blamed. Yes, it is the kind of transport in which dissolved substances or particles move from region of higher concentration to lower concentration with no external energy involved. Since this transport does not require energy from external source, It is also called passive transport. Diffusion occurs when particles, gases, or dissolved substances are mobile or free to move as they spread from where they are in high concentration to the region where they are in low concentration throughout the concentration gradient. The concentration gradient is an environment in which particles are distributed in different concentrations, keeping high concentration region on one side and low concentration on the other side. In the human body, the blood takes oxygen using this simple mode of passive transport, in which oxygen moves from alveolar air spaces in which it happens to be in higher concentration, to the blood where it is used to be in lower concentration. It can also be conceived as the mode of transport in which substances move from region of abundance to the region of demand, where their concentration is lower. Cells use a bit different, yet sophisticated kind of diffusion. They use some carrier proteins to take in the required substance of nutrients, and since this mode involves facilitation of these proteins, to allow these substances inside the cell through the membrane. This kind of diffusion is called facilitated diffusion. An important example is that of blood. Oxygen binds with red blood cells in the bloodstream through facilitated diffusion, which gives us oxygenated blood.
Okay, I hope that helped. We're going to move on to the next movement, which is osmosis. Once again, this has real-life implications. This is why plants do well in a watery environment to a point. And there are certain things in your body that move water by osmosis. So the first thing, osmosis means diffusion of water. Now, what I should have there is water molecules across a semi-permeable membrane. That example I had earlier, this one, which is salt, those salt particles are diffusing, not the water molecules. Osmosis just involves the movement of water molecules. So there's two ways you can look at this. It's the movement of water molecules from a high water molecule concentration to a low water molecule concentration. There's another way to look at this. Fluids that have high concentrations of water molecules, they also have what is called a low osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure kind of represents like a pulling force. Low solute concentrations, low water molecule concentrations like this here. See, this has salt. See how there's a few salt particles? There's more water here than in this particular side. Here you have more salt particles, more solutes, and less water molecules. Fluids that have low water molecule concentration have what's called a high osmotic pressure. Water is drawn to high osmotic pressures. And in other words, high solute concentration. The best way I can give you some real life examples, think about the driest food in the world, or think about food that's freeze dried and has to be, you have to put water in it to rehydrate it. Those do not spoil because they are super dry. Microbes cause food spoilage, and microbes cannot survive. Most microbes, except for a halophile, which I had mentioned earlier, cannot survive high osmotic pressure environments. So any kind of foods that are dry or freeze-dried, they last longer. If you leave hamburger meat out all day, it already has microbes present. It's got about 1 million bacteria per gram. But they're going to break down the meat. It's going to spoil. They're going to get toxins, and you don't want to eat it because you're going to get food poisoning. But anything dry, people put cucumbers on their eyes. They do all these different things to draw water out of their skin. If you sit in a bathtub full of highly concentrated salt water, it'll actually make you lose more body water to the outside. So anything with a high concentration of solids or solutes and less water molecules, it has a strong pulling force for water. This is actually the greatest example ever. I'm going to let you watch another video, but here you have, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 6 salt molecules here, and you can tell there's many more here. The natural tendency of water molecules, and it's a form of diffusion. Here you have more water molecules because there's less space being taken up by salt. Over here you have less water molecules, more salt particles. So it's just like diffusion. Here you have a high concentration of water molecules or a low osmotic pressure, and then on this side you're going to have less water molecules, higher osmotic pressure. That is the whole basis of osmosis. Now, solutions that are hypertonic would be this one. They have high concentrations of solids. As a result, if you place human cells or any kind of a cell in a hypertonic solution, it's going to lose water to the outside. And so it says right there, has a high osmotic pressure. Hypertonic solutions cause cells to shrink. This right there is an example of a hypertonic solution. This is a red blood cell. Those represent solid particles that could be sugar, salt, anything, the pink. See how this is shrinking? Because it's losing water to the outside. Because the outside has a higher concentration of solutes, a high osmotic pressure, compared to the inside. And I have another couple examples. This term isotonic. Iso means same. That's a concentration, a fluid that has the same concentration of solutes as a cell does. What you get there is you get what's called equal movement, either the same movement in and out or no movement whatsoever. On this picture I was using here, this on the left, see the arrows kind of showing equal flow? That represents an isotonic solution. And if you counted, see it's got the little purple, those are representing solid particles. They have about the same on each side. So that's called an isotonic solution. And then the last category, hypotonic. Hypotonic solutions have more water molecules, less solids, or maybe no solids, no solutes. This one here is an example of a hypotonic solution. See all the water molecules, no little pink dots, and then inside here you can see all the little pink dots. Even though there's only a few solids inside here, this is still going to have a higher osmotic pressure because there's more solids, less water on the inside compared to the outside. So it's just like diffusion. Here you have a bunch of water molecules. They're always going to move where there's less water molecules. These cause cells to swell up, and in some cases with human cells, they'll burst. On your diagram here, this is an isotonic solution, a red blood cell. They're very famous for these examples. They're very fragile. This is called crenation. This is a hypertonic solution. See, all the water's been lost. And then here is a hypotonic solution. This is actually gained water. So hypotonic solution cause cells to swell up. Hypertonic solutions cause cells to shrink. Now, in the case of a plant, the increased amount of water moving into a cell is a good thing. They make them turgid, but plant cells flourish with that because they have cell walls. They're not going to burst. Same thing with a bacteria. They're not necessarily going to burst. Plant cells and bacteria cells that have cell walls, when they shrink like this, it actually pulls the cell membrane away from the cell wall and ends up killing the cell. So plants can't survive super dry environments as a result of that. Okay, just a couple more examples. There's another red blood cells, if you can tell, are very famous. See, here's one bursting in a hypotonic solution. Here's an isotonic solution, and here's one that has lost water in a hypertonic solution. Same iso there. This is a hypertonic. This is a hypotonic. And it's all based on random movement. This does not require energy or anything.
Transport will be used. Let's start with diffusion. The lovely smells of the cake spread around the room by diffusion. Diffusion is the process in which particles spread out from each other. They move from high concentration, so right by the cake, to an area of low concentration, so everywhere else in the room. In diffusion, particles move down the concentration gradient until they are evenly distributed. For particles to move like this, they need to be a gas or particles of a dissolved substance. Diffusion is seen throughout nature, and allows substances to pass into or out of cells across the cell membrane. But they must be dissolved, and there must be a concentration gradient that they can move from high concentration to low concentration. Gas exchange in the lungs, so oxygen moving from the alveoli into the blood and carbon dioxide from the blood into the alveoli, are both great examples of diffusion. Carbon dioxide moving from the air into the leaves of plants also moves by diffusion, but it doesn't have to be a gas. How digested foods like amino acids move from the small intestine into the blood also moves by diffusion. You can also have facilitated diffusion, where the movement is still down the concentration gradient, but special carrier proteins are required to enable the movement. Glucose and ions need carrier proteins to move across the membrane. Osmosis is very similar to diffusion, but just for water. It is the movement of water into or out of a cell. Again, it is the movement from a dilute solution, so high concentration of water molecules, down the concentration gradient to a more concentrated solution, so low concentration of water molecules. The water molecules move across a partially permeable membrane. Water molecules move at random, so some do go back across the membrane. But the overall net effect is that there is movement to the more concentrated side, or the side with less water, until equilibrium is reached, or until there is no net movement of water anymore. Osmosis out of a cell can cause big changes. Animal cells shrivel up, and in plant cells the membrane and cytoplasm shrink away from the cell wall, causing the cell to become flaccid. And if osmosis causes lots of movement of water into the cell, plant cells swell and become turgid. They have a strong cell wall which prevents them from bursting, whereas animal cells don't have a cell wall, and so they burst. The absorption of water by plant roots and the absorption of water in the small intestine and the colon all use osmosis. So we know all about the movement of gases and water, but what is active transport for? Watch part 2 to learn about active transport.
Active transport, see at the bottom, requires energy. This is where a cell has to push something against a concentration gradient. This would be like going uphill. Here you have a particle C, and then it says high concentration here, lower concentration here, and it's being pushed against that gradient. That requires energy because the natural tendency of molecules is to go from high to low. So active transport, there's about 3 things. It does require a channel or carrier protein. It is going against a concentration gradient, so it's going from low to high. And it does involve the use of cellular energy. So it's kind of those 3 things. Requires a cell to expend, is an active process that requires a cell to expend energy. Maybe this will help. Why don't you watch this short video on this, and then we'll come back.
In the first part of this video, we looked at diffusion for the movement of gases and osmosis for the movement of water. They were things that could easily move from a high concentration to a low concentration. That makes sense. So what is active transport for? Well, the clue is in the name, active. Work has to be done. Active transport moves molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration against the concentration gradient. This is the opposite of diffusion and osmosis, and because it is not the natural direction, energy is required to make it work. Active transport is carried out by protein carriers within the cell membrane, and they have a specific binding site for the exact molecules they are transporting. The substance binds to the protein carrier on the low concentration side, and using energy from respiration, the protein carrier releases the substance on the other side of the cell membrane, where it is already at a high concentration. See the difference between diffusion? No energy is needed because the molecules can just slide down the concentration gradient, whereas in active transport, they are joining the crowd, and so more effort is needed, hence the ATP. Active transport allows cells to absorb substances from very dilute solutions, such as root hair cells taking in mineral ions from the soil, and in kidneys, so we can hang on to the substances our body needs, such as glucose and sodium ions. Cells which carry out a lot of active transport often have lots of mitochondria to give them the energy they need. So from these 2 parts, You should know how cells take in substances and get rid of waste by diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Just remember that for diffusion, the substance moves down the concentration gradient from a high concentration to a low concentration. Just think of the slide. You don't need any energy to go from high to low. It's easy. Whereas active transport is the opposite. The substance needs to move up the concentration gradient from low concentration to a high concentration. Think of climbing a ladder. You need energy to go from low down to high up.
So that example at the end, it was talking about how going down a slide is a good example of diffusion, and going up a ladder is active transport. That's kind of what this is saying, moving uphill. You see here, you're pushing it against a gradient. Well, this is showing diffusion. Active transport is you're going against the gradient. It does require cellular ATP. Some microbes are capable of making toxins, and it's called exocytosis. That's a form of active transport. That's where something is made inside of a cell and it's released to the outside of a cell. And then endocytosis is where a cell can bring things across, and that's like a white blood cell eating a bacteria, a solid thing, and it has to bring this whole thing across the membrane. That also requires energy. So here's diffusion. See all these little particles moving across the membrane. It's easily diffusible here. This is a permeable substance that can cross the cell membrane. Here's facilitated diffusion, having to use a channel, but it's still a movement from high to low. And then here's a part. See, there's the ADP and the phosphate. We talked about that last week. Here it's being broken, and the energy is being released and captured, and it's pushing these substances against a concentration gradient. Okay, so I hope that helps. That is the end of this section, and thanks for joining me.